that we are so deeply connected with each other, that what we do to someone else, we're effectively doing to ourselves. And if people knew that was a universal spiritual law, then a lot of things that people wouldn't even dream of doing anymore. Why would one hurt oneself? Why would one not live for the whole in a spirit of service and love and dedication and compassion and care? That's what it's about. And Peter Dunoff said, we're here in the physical world to be examined on the law of love and how we apply the law of love. And our life review afterwards will give us a result, as it were, as to how we've managed that.
Welcome to Mind the Shift. I am Anders Bolling, your host. A crucial aspect of shifting minds in a shifting world, which this podcast is all about, is to overcome the artificial dichotomy between science and spirituality. It's difficult to find anything that has a greater potential to have an impact. And Western science has had the upper hand over spirituality for centuries, but perhaps something is changing. Perhaps something is moving in an integrating direction. I just yesterday read a mainstream article about a mainstream Swedish film director who is now going to make a film about the fascinating Swedish painting artist Hilma af Klint. And the word spiritual was mentioned 4 times in the article. That's just an anecdote, but still. One of the most interesting and inspiring initiatives lately in this shift is the creation of something called the Galileo Commission. It's a project of a worldwide professional community, the Scientific and Medical Network. And the Commission's steering committee is led by David Lorimer, who is my guest today. Welcome, David. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Anders. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, you have truly created a lot in your life, apart from having various academic degrees and being a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. You're a writer, a lecturer, and an editor. You founded Character Education Scotland. You are a founding member of the International Futures Forum. And you are a program director of the Scientific and Medical Network. And you've written and edited over a dozen books. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So there are titles like The Spirit of Science and Thinking Beyond the Brain, and the latest one is called Quest for Wisdom. And you've also written a book about the ideas and work of the Prince of Wales.
Indeed.
These are just samples. And one thing that's also truly interesting and relevant for this subject that we're going to delve into, hopefully today, is that you have been the president of the Swedenborg Society.
I have. Yes.
And yeah, that's actually a connection to the sliver of land that I happen to live in, Sweden. So what was it about Emanuel Swedenborg that drew you into his mystical world?
Well, that's so interesting because it happened quite early on in my path, as it were. And what happened was I was studying French literature, and particularly the poetry of Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire. And my tutor gave us the Garnier edition, which actually I have behind me in this bookshelf. And one of his most famous poems is called Correspondances, Correspondance in French. And so I was looking through the notes of this, and it said that this idea of correspondences was influenced by Swedenborg. So I thought, well, who is this man? And so I borrowed a book out of the university library, which was a biography by a man called Trowbridge. And one evening in my room, I just sat down to read it. And the more I read, the more amazed I was to discover that here was someone trained in science and mathematics and engineering. He was offered the chair of mathematics at Uppsala University at the age of 27, for instance. He was one of the great civil engineers of his time. He sat in the upper house of the Swedish Parliament. And when he was 55, having already written a 2-volume book on the brain. It's about 750 pages. It's probably the longest book ever written on the brain up until that point, and where he talks a little bit about possible lateralization of hemisphere functions. He was one of the first people to suggest that. He suddenly had an opening, and he found himself able to see into what he called the invisible worlds and have conversations with departed people, and have various clairvoyant experiences, which were well attested at the time. And what was amazing for me was that he brought the same kind of dispassionate observational scientific qualities, philosophical qualities. He wrote in Latin still, which is quite unusual, I think, at that stage.
Yeah.
And he described these extraordinary experiences in completely matter-of-fact terms, as if he was simply describing, going out to lunch with a friend. So that was very striking. And so you had these extraordinary experiences narrated in a very ordinary way, and with really complete conviction. So it was that aspect of it, and you'll find in Heaven and Hell is his main book on this subject. But also what interested me was his philosophy, and one of his main theological or spiritual texts was called Divine Love and Wisdom. And in his exegesis of Revelation, for instance, in parts of the Old Testament, what he was always driving at was the spiritual sense, not the literal sense of the scripture. And he didn't believe at all in the vicarious atonement, the idea that Christ died for our sins on the cross. He thought that was completely wrong. And he even claimed to have argued about this with the deceased spirits of Luther, Calvin, and Melanchthon. And so that was my kind of introduction to Swedenborg. And then I read a lot of his work, and I have more or less his complete works in my library in Scotland.
Yeah, he was. I mean, I had to Google him a little bit and read about him, because I knew that he had been the president of this society. So, I mean, I'm a Swede, but I really didn't know very much about him. Just that he was a mystic and all that. He's not very big. I mean, in the mainstream, he's not very big, but there are certain, of course, societies here in Sweden as well who know a lot about him. But
well, anyway, that's right, and I think that. I think Kant is partly responsible for him not being in the mainstream, because he wrote a book in 1766 called Dreams of a Spirit Seer, in which he didn't even spell his name right. He kind of poured scorn on Swedenborg and thinking he was just a dream. It was just dreams. He was a spirit seer. He wasn't a serious person. But at the same time, Kant had sent his own detective or his own private investigators to check out some of the alleged clairvoyant experiences, and he was satisfied that they had actually happened. But he said philosophers find themselves, and this is still true in academic terms, they find themselves in this position where they can't really believe something because it's beyond their boggle threshold, and yet they can't deny that it happened. And so they rather ignore it, and as we say in the Galileo Commission, they fail to look through the telescope, or they refuse to look through the telescope. And so what was happening in the 1760s, it was academic fear of reputation, is still alive now in the 2020s.
That's fascinating. And he had, I mean, as you have been describing, he made this shift in his career from traditional or Western science, where he excelled truly, into this spiritual realm. He had this spiritual calling. And you yourself, I mean, not to compare you to Swedenborg directly, but still, you started out as a merchant banker.
Yes, that was an interesting.
That seems like a shift in career as well, because you're now dealing with
very much. Well, I come from a very conventional background. And so it was my family's expectation, particularly my father's expectation, that I would go into merchant banking. And we had a cousin who was in merchant banking, and it was very respectable. And he could go to a drinks party and say, well, my son is working in a merchant bank. Whereas he just couldn't understand, my son is working for the Scientific and Medical Network. He didn't understand what that was about at all. And also, when I was a teacher, that was fine as well. My son teaches at Winchester College, and so it was difficult for him, to be able to explain the unexplainable to his friends. when it's such a different world.
Yeah.
So yes, and I kind of pressed the eject button, as I put it, from that conventional merchant banking career in 1976 when I was 24.
Okay, so that's when your real career started and what you really wanted to dive into.
And I took 4 boxes of books with me to Champagne, Moët-et-Chandon, Champagne and Épernay in autumn of 1976, which was a very hot year, you might remember.
Yes.
And it was a very early vintage, the earliest since 1893. But interestingly, now it's not unusual at all, 40, 50 years later, to have the vintage beginning at the beginning of September or even earlier. And that tells you something about the shift of temperatures.
Interesting. So let's talk about the Galileo Commission. Can you just, simply tell the audience, the listeners and the viewers, what the purpose is of Galileo Commission and why the name Galileo?
Yes, well, it was a small group of us who had the idea. Chris Thompson, who's no longer with us, was one of the initiators, and he was originally going to be writing the Galileo report. And what we were doing was really trying to extend the mission of the network to widen horizons in science, medicine, and philosophy and psychology by producing a rigorous report, which was written by Professor Harold Wallach. Harold was an ideal person to write the report because he has 2 PhDs, one in history of science and one in clinical psychology. And then he also has a background in parapsychology and physics, complementary medicine, and mind-body issues. And so, he's very, very wide range of interest and remit. And so the idea was to produce a rigorous report, which was looking at the assumptions behind modern science, particularly scientific materialism. And then also the evidence, which seems to contradict this, and to put forward the proposal that the brain does not produce consciousness in the way that's assumed by 99.9% of scientists, philosophers, and psychologists. But as William James suggested as far back as 1898, it might in some sense filter or transmit or permit certain ranges of consciousness. And this is really what we were getting at. And I wrote about this in my first book, which I wrote in 1982, nearly 40 years ago, which came out in 1984, called Survival. And I was struck by this William James SOL lecture on immortality, and also by other thinkers of the time, Henri Bergson, the French Nobel Prize for Literature and philosopher, who was hugely popular in his day, but most people have forgotten him now, even in France. And F.C.S. Schiller, who was a philosophy don at Oxford, who'd written something called the Riddles of the Sphinx anonymously in 1891. And I imagine he was afraid of what his colleagues would think if he took a different view as well. So the Galileo Commission report is in 3 versions. There is the main report with all the academic references, about 130 pages. There's a summary report, which is more a sort of summary of the argument. And then there is a layman's version. And then in addition to that, in 11 languages, we have a summary of the argument in 2 pages, which just sort of boils the whole thing down. And I think the proposition is that we need a new philosophy, a new approach, which is either what Harold Wallach argues for, which is a dual aspect theory, which is similar to David Bohm in some ways, or an idealist view. And some of our advisors, like Eben Alexander, for instance, he takes an idealist view, Bernardo Kastrup also. So there are quite a few people who, there's idealism and the idea that the universe is fundamentally mental is coming back into fashion, as is panpsychism. And why Galileo? Well, the famous story, we actually used not the cardinals, because the sometimes that story is not as well attested as a story which is in a letter from Galileo to Kepler. And he said, the professor of philosophy at Padua, here in Padua, pertinaciously refuses to look through my glass. In other words, he won't look to see if there are moons on Jupiter, because he knows in advance this can't be possible.
Yeah.
And so
I don't even have to look. Yeah.
Yeah. So the parallel is that the scientists not only do not look at, by and large, at evidence which would seem to contradict the premises of scientific materialism. They actively denigrate such evidence in skeptical campaigns, in extreme skeptical campaigns that you have going, for instance, on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And they don't feel at all comfortable. But the irony of this whole situation is that if you ask a lot of them personally, have they had experience which would cause them to think there must be more to life than scientific materialism, than more to life than just matter, they often will say they have, but they don't dare to admit it to their colleagues, who ironically are in exactly the same situation.
Yeah.
And so, I remember, just to make this concrete, I remember Ken Ring, who's one of the early pioneers of near-death experiences, wrote Life at Death and Heading Towards Omega in the 1980s, and was one of the first presidents of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. He was giving a talk at a book club, and there were 10 members of this book club, and each of them came up to him before the talk saying, well, I've had these interesting experiences because I'd never share them with anybody here because they would think I was mad. And so there's a kind of taboo here which we really have to break through, not only, and I think the general public is further ahead, but we have to break through this taboo where to make these experiences, valid experiences and to be taken seriously.
Mm. You said in an interview, I think on an interview for Science and Non-Duality, SAND, some time ago, that modern science has no clothes. So
yes, well, yes, the emperor has no clothes. In other words, you're looking, you look as if everything is normal, but actually it isn't. But I prefer the telescope analogy because it's exactly, you're refusing to look at evidence. I mean, I can give Rupert Sheldrake, for instance, just another example. He was having an interview with Peter Atkins, and Peter Atkins is a professor of physical chemistry at Oxford, and he's one of the most vociferous proponents of scientific materialism. He said everything, including consciousness, will ultimately be explained on the basis of existing scientific principles. And I remember sitting next to him in Cambridge, actually, at a meeting. Anyway, they were discussing telepathy on Radio 5 Live, and Rupert had sent in advance some of his peer-reviewed papers on telepathy to Peter Atkins. And he asked if he'd read them, and said, of course not. I know that the telepathy is impossible, so there's no point in reading any papers which assumes that it could happen. And this is not scientific. This is not.
It's so unscientific. It's incredible. Really.
I mean, how do people like that get away with it?
Acting like an ostrich, putting his head in the sand.
Well, it's an interesting analogy, that, because I was just been reviewing Is Consciousness Primary, which is a new volume from the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. And Gary Schwartz says there are two sorts of science. There's eagle science, where you take a big view, from above. And then there's ostrich science, when you refuse to look at anything. And so I rather like this analogy of ostrich science.
Yeah. But also, as you say, the telescope analogy is brilliant, not least because Galileo he was a great scientist. He was one of the first people who that's where Western science began, more or less, or thereabouts. And then at that time, it was the people from the church who were the ostriches. And this time it's the other way around.
Well, that's the irony, because science should be about open-minded curiosity and looking at the evidence. It should be evidence-based. And so what we're suggesting is that the evidence base for a science of consciousness needs to be widened and deepened. And more sort of epistemologically, which is how we know things, we need to reinstate the Greek concept of gnosis, which is this direct, immediate knowing of deeper structures of reality, which, is example, from Federico Fagin's new book, Silicon. He's the inventor of the Intel microprocessor, who had exactly the kind of gnosis experience, which completely flipped his view. And sometimes Jeffrey Kripal, I don't know whether you know his work, he's got a book called The Flip. And that's actually what we need to happen, is for lots of people to have personal experiences that are undeniable. Then they flip into a different view of consciousness and life.
Yeah. What's fascinating when you mention we need to have a lot of people with these experiences is that near-death experiences have become much more common or much more documented because of the medical science ability to resuscitate people, which began in the 60s, more or less. So, I mean, there are millions and millions of people today who have had these experiences. It's very difficult to just refute them and just dismiss them. And that's central. I mean, I've read this layman's report or layman's guide to this Galileo Commission, and I know that you are talking a lot about NDEs in that guide.
Well, you may know that the most recent publication on this, which received a lot of publicity, is Bruce Grayson's book After. And Bruce Grayson was a professor in neurobehavioral sciences and psychiatry at the University of Virginia, and he draws on 50 years of research and 100 papers he's written and other books he's written, and the Grayson scale, which is all about what is a near-death experience, how can you identify one. And so I think that at that level, the evidence is being taken seriously. But we need to drill down, I think, to this assumption, which most people make, and it's the standard view in journalism as well, that the brain is entirely responsible for the production of consciousness.
Yeah, we are so conditioned to believing that. I mean, this is what we are taught in school, for one thing. So it's very difficult to break that. But as you say, well, sometimes paradigm shifts happen, actually. So let's just hope for that. So what is science to you? If you would define it in your words, because this is all about bridging the gap between science and spirituality, and also you have mentioned all these disciplines that we talk about: psychiatry, psychology, medicine, physics, biology. What's your take on our dividing this into different disciplines? That's one question. And the second question is if we are going to bridge this gap between this materialistic view and a more holistic view, where the spiritual realm is a natural part of the whole thing. How would you describe that? So that would be I think new big science, I guess.
Yes, I think one needs to go back to the origins of science, or the current scientific worldview in the 17th century. We mentioned Galileo, there's Newton, there's Descartes, there's Locke. There are various people who were involved in formulating this. And maybe the most important distinction that they made at the time was between what they called primary and secondary qualities. And so a primary quality is what you can see, weigh, touch, measure. And a secondary quality like taste, or anything to do with the senses and perception and consciousness, that's secondary. And the primary produces the secondary. So philosophically, it means that the mind produces the brain produces consciousness. This is the logic of it. And what it does is it removes the observer. And Schrödinger realized this in an essay called Nature and the Greeks. And if you remove the observer, then you sort of sliced out an essential aspect of reality. And the way that science developed is towards quantification, obviously repetition in the scientific method of experiments, so that anybody can prove something anywhere in the world, as Marilyn Monk often says when she's explaining her view. But the point to retain is that the outer is primary, matter is primary. So anything inner or the mind or consciousness is to be explained by the primacy of matter. So that's the point I wanted to make very, very clear, but because that's what's been driving the development of scientific epistemology, and in the 20th century, you had a philosophy of positivism, which tried to get rid of metaphysics and said there's no such thing as metaphysics; it's all nonsense. But that actually has been undermined because the work of the current work of Ian McGilchrist, for instance, the work of Nicholas Maxwell, the work of E.A. Burt, Metaphysical Foundations in Modern Science, Willis Harman in the 1990s, R.G. Collingwood at Oxford in 1940's essay on metaphysics. And what's very, very clear is that you can't do science without a philosophy. You have to have logic, you have to have ways of knowing, there are different levels of knowing, and so that's what I wanted to drill down on. So science as in its pure form is simply an approach, a systematic approach to data and repeatability. And most of it is based on quantification and statistics. And so the qualitative aspect, the qualia that we experience as philosophers and psychologists call this, it is something that is secondary to this notion of quantification, what Rune Genel called the reign of quantity. And so if you were to say, well, science as presently constituted looks mainly from the outside in, you could then say, well, spirituality is complementary in that it looks from the inside out.
Yeah.
But as soon as you think about this more carefully, you realize that science also depends on consciousness and structures of consciousness, meaning, theories, models, all of which are produced and generated by consciousness. And so as Max Planck and Schrödinger and Wolfgang Pauli and various of the other, Henry Stapp, they realize you can't take consciousness out of the equation. And the most recent thing I read on this, which was very interesting, was an essay by Edward Close. And he's a physicist. I can't understand the mathematics of what he said, but he said the theory of everything cannot exclude consciousness. That's what's missing. And people have been trying to create a theory of everything just on a material basis. But you can't close the loop, as it were, without including consciousness. So I see the relationship between science and spirituality as basically a complementary one. And if you were looking at Marilyn Monks, then there's the scientist, the poet, and the mystic. So the poet is the artist, concerned with beauty. The scientist is the measurer, the objective part of us, and then the mystic is the subjective part that can experience gnosis, can experience what happens in near-death and mystical experience, and that we are consciousness. We are the one. The one is already within us.
Do you believe that consciousness precedes matter, that it comes in that order?
Well, I don't know that we know enough to be able to say it's like a mystery, to be able to make a definitive statement. And so what's been happening is that people have been insisting on at least the fundamental nature of consciousness, if not the primacy of consciousness. So obviously, to go to the primacy of consciousness is a step beyond saying consciousness is fundamental. And we actually had in the Scientific and Medical Network, we produced a manifesto to this effect. About 20 years ago, we had a small group working on this. It was a kind of precursor to the Galileo Commission. And so I think what has to go philosophically and scientifically is this insistence on the primacy of matter. But the difficulty for scientists is to square that idea with the current narrative and cosmological story, which has consciousness emerging from material complexity as the story. But
it's a bit counterintuitive. If you're not a scientist, it's very counterintuitive actually to think of it that way. That matter is all there is in a way. It's like, I know you mentioned Occam's razor in that guide as well, and I've actually tried to write a little essay on that, and I used Occam's razor. And you, in that layman's guide, you're a bit critical to the use of Occam's razor, which is a method whereby you come to the conclusion that the simplest explanation is the right one, basically. And
well, I sometimes call it Occam's hatchet. Rather than Occam's razor, because I agree in the principle of parsimony, which is what it's about, and simplicity. But what it's often used as a restatement of reductionism, to say that reductionism as a method and the conclusions of reductionism, the whole can be reduced to the sum of its parts, is true, represents truth, and it doesn't.
Because it reduces the experience of the experiencer.
Well, it certainly does that, but it also it's a methodological idea that you arrive at truth through reductionism and mechanism and materialism, and you arrive at a view through that, and it's a view which is conditioned by that method, but you can't logically say that is the truth.
No. Well, when I used that, did my little trial there, I enhanced it a little bit because I added intuition to the razor. And if you use intuition, I came to the conclusion that it's actually the simplest explanation to whether we are whether consciousness is non-local and non-material, or it is the other way around, that we're only randomly assembled flesh robots, so to speak. The more simple explanation intuitively is that we are more than matter, because it's, I think, purpose and meaning is the default mode, so to speak, within us. And that's, of course, only philosophically speaking. I'm not a scientist, but I think it's very small children know this, and then they are talked out of it.
I think that's true, but I also think that we need to come back to this huge power, or the mechanistic metaphor, and this goes back to the 17th century. The idea that the world is a machine, that the world was best understood as a machine, which was originally clockwork. It was a clock, argument from design. So Newton's universe, as it were, is a clockwork mechanical universe in which everything is determined. We now know that's not true because of quantum theory. And therefore the brain is then, originally it was at the end of the 19th century, it was a kind of telegraph station. And then, of course, now it becomes a computer. And so a lot of sophisticated people working in AI will simply say that, we are biochemical machines. That's it. The essence of the human can be understood mechanistically, and consciousness can be understood mechanistically as well. And so I think we have a kind of metaphysical battle going on here to avoid the reductionist idea, or to transcend the reductionist idea that we can be explained simply in biochemical terms. So, for instance, if you come back to the beginning of our conversation, this morning I've just been reading a new book on life after death. There can't be any life after death or consciousness after death if you take a mechanistic, materialistic view. It's just impossible in principle. Yeah. And yet there is a lot of evidence in this direction. So what do you do? How do you explain this? And if we do survive death, and we have this transcendent divine essence to us, then we are not simply biological machines. There may be there obviously is a biological aspect to us, but then the biology itself should be understood in terms of the metaphor of the organism and systems, levels of systems within an organism, holons, if you like, rather than the machine. So we need to get rid of this idea that the truth can be arrived at through mechanistic metaphor. It's what Rupert Sheldrake calls mechanomorphism. Not anthropomorphism, but mechanomorphism.
Yeah, he's brilliant. I love him. Yeah, maybe it's, well, or not maybe, I'm convinced that it's fear behind this rejection of all these ideas that you're talking about here, because people are, of course, very afraid of shedding their old worldviews, and also if they're scientists, they're afraid of losing funding, for instance. So they don't want to walk that path.
No, I think that's true. I mean, fear of loss of reputation, funding, but then it depends on what is regarded as credible or plausible, and that changes obviously with advances in knowledge. And so I think what part of our job is to make these areas more credible and acceptable. And if you look at the people who have taken them seriously in the past, like the presidents of the Society for Psychical Research, for instance, it includes numerous fellows of the Royal Society and even Nobel Prize winners. And these aren't stupid people. They're not just taken in. It's almost, I think it's true to say that anyone who looks at the evidence impartially and thoroughly, arrives at the conclusion that you can't just write it all off.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's really, maybe they are afraid that if this other view, this more holistic view, this view that spirituality is real, if it's true, then the material worldview is completely false. So they're afraid of getting rid of that whole concept. But as you say, I mean, of course, the material world is also true. I mean, that it's nothing false about it. Or you can say philosophically, in some philosophies, in some religions, you're talking about that it's an illusion, and in a way, you might call it an illusion, but it's real enough. If you cut yourself with a knife, it hurts, and you can taste chocolate and everything. So it's of course it's real. But this new enhanced view of how the world functions should make these scientists happy, because it makes it so much more interesting, and it opens up so many doors, and it makes life so much more fascinating.
Yes, I agree. And obviously what we're talking about here in terms of a paradigm shift is always an expansion of our view. It's not a contraction. It's an expansion. So that what we already know will be reframed, recontextualized, and put into a larger picture. And so in that sense, there's nothing to be afraid of. But I think that there is a residual equation of religion with superstition and belief, and there not being any evidence for it. It's the kind of Richard Dawkins, the new atheists, they take that view. But I think what's missing here, and it's also missing from a lot of conventional religion, is the mystical Gnostic aspect, where people know from experience, like Federico we were talking about. And he said the experience hit me with a force of truth. In other words, he couldn't not apprehend this as truth.
Yeah.
And you see the Greeks, we have a Greek colleague, in fact, two Greek colleagues on the Galileo Commission steering group, appropriately. And they regarded gnosis, and indeed the early Christian fathers regarded gnosis as a superior form of knowing, a higher, deeper form of knowing, because you knew intuitively, using your word, immediately, directly, that you and the divine were one, or the transcendent, if you want to use a different language. Whereas reason and analysis is discursive and indirect, and so the level of logic and reason is not one of experience. It's analyzing and structuring your experience. So if we could recover this, know thyself, it said in Delphi, and thou shalt know the universe. The Hermetic view that the as above, so below, as within, so without.
Exactly.
And so I think our deeper science of consciousness is really an attempt to recover this lost tradition.
Yes, it's much like when you have been very much in love, and most of us have, I think. And when you come out of that, that's the difference between having this experience and it's extremely true. It's more real than anything you have ever experienced when you're in it, and then you get out of it, and then you start analyzing, and you reduce it and deduct it, and you kind of it was just no, I wasn't really in love, and I can't understand why I was in love with her. And I mean, it's very strange. I think you've heard Bruce Lipton talk about the honeymoon effect and all those things.
Yes, I think there's oxytocin effect in there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, maybe it could be.
I think you do.
But it's like you're in the now. You're in the now moment. You're present, and you're just there. It's like meditation. You know, you're present in the moment, and then you just realize that you exist, that you're here, and all that thinking doesn't really matter. You don't have to think. I mean, you don't have to analyze. You just know things. That's what
all the great sages say. We need to be in the present moment. Yeah. But I feel one needs to go from being in love to standing in love, as somebody put it. Yeah. In other words, the cultivation of love. You get a kind of start by falling in love, and then the real work starts. You know, when you, as my wife said to me, when you marry someone, you've got someone to annoy you every day, and then we have all these little foibles. We all have our slightly different way of doing things, and even washing up and that sort of thing. And so you really have to bring a sense of humor and proportion into this, but the love is still there.
Yeah, well, of course it's different layers. It's more, it gets deeper when you stand in love, as you say. The thing I was talking about was perhaps infatuation and that first phase and all that.
But actually, talking of which, Anders, we should mention here that all these experiences of light that people have in the NDE, for instance, or in the mystical state, they're also experiences of love. And you can't actually separate the light from the love. One is the heart of the other, or the light is the light of the heart, if you like. And so they're undifferentiated, and this is why these experiences have such a transformative effect. And in the old mystery schools, this was part of initiation, that people would know that they had an immortal essence and spirit at their center, and not just read about it. They knew, or they GNU, if you like, with a gnosis.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, the L word is probably a bit difficult to introduce into the scientific world. Talking about love.
Well, I think the Templeton Foundation has sponsored quite a bit of research into these areas. So there's research on forgiveness, and there's research on love. There's Stephen Post at I forget which university he is, but he started with Sir John Templeton the Institute for Unlimited Love. And he said, Sir John said, we don't want just love, we want unlimited love. You know,
yes.
We want the real thing. Yeah, and
unconditional love.
Yes, he set it up not long before he passed over, and he was an extraordinary man who lived until he was nearly 96. And his vision has funded a lot of this what you might call research in spirituality.
Yeah, I guess this unconditional love is the thing that repeats itself, that everyone who has had these deep experiences talk about, NDEers or other out-of-body experiencers or deep meditation. Well, they all talk about unconditional love.
Well, the person who has inspired me most, Peter Dunoff, or Bense Duno, to give him his spiritual name, he has these 5 principles, and love is the first of the principles, followed by wisdom, truth, justice, and virtue or goodness. These are the 5 essential principles. And he says love brings life. And by love, I don't just mean sentiment. I mean, it holds the whole universe together. So interestingly, the French for gravitation is attraction.
Yeah.
And so it's the attractive force. And so I think we need a new language of love, because that's actually the answer to a lot of our problems if we were to put it into practice.
Exactly, we can see it as if Gaia loves us. Our planet Gaia loves us because it attracts us.
Well, I think we better get a move on and do some loving back.
Yeah, else, that's what I mean.
We might get thrown off as an undesirable.
Yeah. Okay, this is a question where you might not want to go, but anyway, I'll give it a shot. If the brain filters consciousness rather than produces it. As already, as you said, William James said in the 1890s, and it's come back, this notion, this concept. What does that say about the origins of humankind, life, and the theory of evolution? Because, I mean, evolution, at the core of evolution, the material evolution thinking is that I mean, the brain was nothing from the beginning, of course, and everything emanates from there, and it's all matter. But if there is some kind of consciousness in the unified field, or whatever you want to call it, out there, that we can access rather than produce, then what does that say about evolution and as I said, the origins of humankind?
Well, I think I'll just frame this in terms of the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who's notoriously difficult to read. His main work is called Process and Reality. But the epilogue is an easy idea to understand, which is that there are two natures of the divine. There is the transcendent nature and the consequent nature. And when you talk about evolution, you're talking about the consequent nature, which represents becoming, the whole process of becoming. When you talk about the transcendent nature, and the Upanishads refer to this as well, then you're talking about something that is beyond time. It's beyond space and time. It's a different dimension altogether. And that is not subject to evolution. The consequent nature is. And so you get this process of emergence, and a lot of people say, well, everything is emergence. You get this whole process of complexification, it's emergence. But I think that misses out this other aspect, which spirituality and religion have always insisted upon, which is the transcendent. And the Upanishads say that if you go only with the transcendent, you fall into deep darkness. And if you go only with the immanent, which is the consequent here, then you fall into deep darkness. And so I think the mystic will tell you, and this is the complementary aspect, that the ultimate reality by their experience is consciousness with a capital C, and that structures the whole material evolutionary process. And I think in terms of the soul, which is another kind of idea, I think Tim Freke has a very interesting take on this, because he talks about the soul as also evolving. And I think that's what Alfred Russel Wallace also said. He was the co-founder of natural selection with Darwin. He said the spiritual evolution as well as material evolution. And so you have to add this other dimension if you're really going to be able to understand what it means to be conscious and the true role of consciousness and mind in the universe.
Yeah. So there are a couple of reading tips there, I guess, for those who want to dive deeper into this. Fascinating. So if we look now a little bit forward here and see what your commission will be able to achieve. Well, firstly, if you ask, you mentioned before that scientists who reject these ideas publicly, they will, if you talk to them at the dinner table, they will admit to some kind of
well, some of them.
Some of them, yes.
Yeah.
But there are surveys being done, aren't there? There have been some surveys 100 years ago and now again, where scientists have been asked whether they believe in an eternal soul, for instance, and those things, or whether they are atheists or agnostic. What do these surveys show? Has there been any movement?
We did surveys ourselves actually about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, and we had Ipsos Mori doing a survey of 1,000 scientific, medical background, engineering background people in the UK, France, and Germany, and we asked them a series of questions, not only about their attitudes to science and spirituality, science and religion, but also whether they'd had any experiences themselves, and whether they thought there was good evidence for, let's say, children remember previous lives. And what you could see was that the people who replied as atheists and agnostics said there wasn't any good evidence, even though there is. In fact, they just haven't looked through that particular telescope. And about 50% of the people surveyed were open to the spiritual view. And so, in other words, the purely materialist view was in the minority. If you actually look at all the figures, whereas the mainstream, you would expect this not to be true, and it is true that if you look at the Royal Society and the American Academy of Sciences, then you get a different picture. You get actually more atheists, but then you then have to think about, well, what's the, particularly in the States, what's the landscape there?
Yeah.
Because you've got really a strong creationist and evolutionist tension. You've got the creationists, which and evangelicals who are very, very strong in the US, and they're not nearly as strong in the UK and probably in Sweden. And then in France, in Italy, you've got a different landscape because you've got Catholicism, and so people are reacting against Catholicism.
So you would have to ask differently in those countries.
Well, yes, and there have been surveys done at Rice University looking at secularity and science in different cultures, including India, so I think it's sort of a nuanced answer depending on the culture, and there is a sort of public intellectual position in France, for instance, where it's really, it's very respectable to be an atheist, and to be vociferously atheist, and to try and suppress any debate. And I've seen this happening with friends of mine. You're not allowed to question that position. Otherwise, we just go straight back to the medieval superstition, which was obviously none of us wants to do.
No. How has the Galileo Commission been received so far? You haven't been.
Well, we've had a lot of interest in our webinars, and in fact, we've got another one coming up on Saturday. And these have been associated, or summits rather, been associated with the launch of various significant books. So we've got the next big book launch we've got coming up is for a trilogy by Gail Kimball on the 15th of May. And then in mid-July, we'll do an event for Consciousness Unbound, which is the latest volume to come out of the University of Virginia and Edward Kelly and his colleagues. The earlier two are Irreducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism. And these are among the go-to books in the area because of the rigor of the science and philosophy in them and the evidence base.
Do you think
so
we
I
are?
think,
yes,
yeah,
we're getting closer to some kind of breaking point, or what you?
Well, my feeling is that and this is why we've set up a group, as you know, within the Galileo Commission of communicators and journalists. That yes. we need a marketing and publicity and communications initiative here, based around some very simple messages, because there are very few people who either will take the time or have the inclination to read 500-page books. And if you're paid up scientific materialist, I mean, the last thing you'd want to read was a volume undermining your views. And so, I mean, the few people who are on Galileo Commission advisory capacity, like Marjorie Willicott would be an example, are people who've had these formative flip experiences, and then, even though they were trained in scientific materialism, they realize it's not complete after they've had this experience. And Federico Fagin would be another example. And so there's a critical role to experience here in terms of really changing your worldview. So the difficulty is this kind of entrenched view, and the fact that the entrenched view is regarded as scientific rather than philosophical. In other words, vast majority of scientists don't know that they're making assumptions about consciousness in the brain. They just take it as a fact. It's a fact that the consciousness is produced by the brain. We don't need to look into it. It's obvious. And indeed, there is a lot of evidence, which you could use to back up that view. But that means ignoring the outer range of evidence, or the extended range of evidence, where this view cannot get a handle on the phenomena and the evidence. It just simply cannot explain it at all. And I think an interesting, and I just started to think about this because I haven't read the book yet. There's a book by Shelley Joy, Joye, called The Electromagnetic Brain. And I think there's a lot of people cited in this book who take that sort of model rather than a purely chemical model. Because if you think that consciousness is a chemical, then of course it can't come out of the brain. It can't, you can't explain chemistry outside the physical system in which it's embedded. But I think electromagnetism is probably, again, only part of the answer here. Because obviously we know that the electroencephalogram, goes flat when we die. And so electricity, we're no longer informed by electricity. But I think there's more to it than that, but that must be an aspect of it.
Perhaps there's a critical mass of scientists who need to flip before this can become mainstream.
I think, but it's also the question in the humanities. And we're looking at trying to reach some people in the humanities on the basis of the work by Jeff Kripal, his book, The Flip, and his more recent chapter in this Consciousness Unbound. And because they are all imbued with materialism as well. And the thing is that the challenges we face as a species, as a planet, are not going to be solved by continuation of materialism and consumerism. We need a spiritual awakening so that we understand that we're all deeply connected with each other, and that we're also deeply embedded and connected with natural ecosystems. So I think there's one life, there's one mind, and there's one planet.
Yeah, and the essence of us cannot die. Consciousness is non-local, and the essence of us cannot die. And if these things are to become mainstream, if they become mainstream in the mainstream thinking of humanity and of science, what will happen? How will that change this world?
Well, I've argued in my second book, which is now called Resonant Mind, that all what we've been talking about implies an ethic of interconnectedness. And you get this out of the life review in the near-death experience and in after-death communications, that we are so deeply connected with each other that what we do to someone else, we're effectively doing to ourselves. And if people knew that was a universal spiritual law, then a lot of things that people wouldn't even dream of doing anymore. Why would one hurt oneself? Why would one not live for the whole in a spirit of service and love and dedication and compassion and care? That's what it's about. And Peter Dunoff said, we're here in the physical world to be examined on the law of love and how we apply the law of love. And our life review afterwards will give us a result, as it were, as to how we've managed that.
That's wonderful. David Lorimer, your latest book is called Quest for Wisdom, and it can be found on in the bookstores.
Well, on Amazon, but also my publisher Aeon, AEON Books.
Okay, Aeon Books, and the website to the commission is GalileoCommission.org, and my own website is davidlorimer.co.uk. Excellent. David Lorimer, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast, and good luck with the commission. And it's a wonderful endeavor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being part of it as well.
I will do what I can.
Great.